Welcome back and to the series on mapping the shadow. My name is Max and this is Make It Conscious. So this episode is called Circumambulation. Curious term, huh? Well, this actually derives straight from Jung. He himself used this term, and it's actually quite a nice concept for understanding the very movement of mind we've been discussing and the way in which the shadow map actually works. So without further ado, let's go to the quote from Jung. In fact, first we're going to go to a preliminary quote from him that leads into it. So he was talking about mandalas, and in his own midlife phase, he became very interested in mandalas and saw something of himself in mandalas and found drawing mandalas very therapeutic, and even prescribed to his patients to paint mandalas as part of their therapy. So he said, "My mandalas were cryptograms concerning the state of the self, which were presented to me anew each day. In them I saw the self, that is, my whole being, actively at work. The self, I thought, was like the monad which I am, and which is my world. The mandala represents this monad, and corresponds to the microcosmic nature of the psyche." So here we have a kind of symbolic proof of the self. There's a lot of confusion around the idea of the self, and a lot of Eastern traditions that actually deny the existence of a self, and not only Eastern but also modern materialism. And it's rather interesting that these two philosophies, if you like, seem to echo each other in this regard. Now it really depends on what we mean by a self and what we mean by no self, and there's no shortage of disagreement around that. But the fact that human beings have a monadal quality insofar as we have this individual existence, which is self-evident. Yeah, the self is self-evident. We could probably just leave it there, but unfortunately we can't, because that's not convincing enough for many. So the fact that human beings tend to draw these things, if you leave anyone alone in a room with a piece of paper and a pen, at some point they're probably going to start drawing concentric circles. That's my bet. I haven't put it to the test, but humans have been doing it all around the world. Mandalas aren't only an Eastern production, and there's mandalas all over ancient Ireland. The Christian cross is a kind of mandala. Where I am in the Caucasus, the Christian cross is more equilateral. So in the West, of course, you have the lower, longer base to the cross, but in the Eastern Orthodox Church, it's just a circle with 4 equal length lines in it. So that's a form of mandala. And of course, the 4 prongs represent the 4 modalities, the quaternity, the 4 things that we can possibly experience in our minds. We have will or intuition, we have emotion, we have intellect, and we have sensation. And curiously, this is also echoed in the Buddhist teaching of the 5 aggregates. We have form, feeling, perception, and volition, plus consciousness itself, which is the means through which they're seen. So it's really a 4 plus 1. So not only is the quaternity a feature of many cultures for pretty clear reasons, because it's reflecting a truth about the nature of the mind, but you also have mandalas, these concentric designs and circles appearing in all these different places and apparently having this therapeutic effect. So why is that? Let's go to the next quote. Jung said, "I began to understand that the goal of psychic development is the self. There is no linear evolution. There is only a circumambulation of the self. Uniform development exists at most at the beginning. Later, everything points towards the center. This insight gave me stability, and gradually my inner peace returned." I suppose we can surmise where his stability came from here, because the idea that there may be a linear path of development can be quite stressful, right? There's plenty of maps of progress out there. We're talking about ego development theory, spiral dynamics, the 4 stages of enlightenment. We're talking about the stages of shadow integration. First there's the shadow, then there's the anima, then there's the self, and all these very prescriptive models, spiral dynamics being one of the better known ones perhaps in our modern age. So the thing is that there's no absolutes here. There is a kind of truth to the fact of evolution. There's kinds of ways in which the mind can be considered more developed or less developed, sure. But it very quickly breaks down because, well, firstly, the mind itself consists of just a countless number of different structures and areas of development. That's one thing. But more importantly, it's because these very ideas themselves are products of the mind. They are mind created. So they too are theses. They are aspects that you can map to a shadow map. You can lay these out. You can see that they have both wholesome and unwholesome elements to them. And you can see how they necessarily leave certain things out that must be reconciled with eventually. So whatever the model is, whether it's the shadow map, whether it's spiral dynamics, whether it's the 7 habits of individuation, mostly named off my own here, whether it's Myers-Briggs, whether it's the Enneagram, they all have massive limits, because they are all merely tools for the discovery of the self. And the challenge is that what happens is that because we're seeing the world in terms of ourselves, and because we're seeing the world in terms of the concepts that we hold close to our minds and that we found useful and that we've used to adapt to the world, right? So we put forward an idea. Well, what's happening is we're seeing what we hold to be true in the world. So if we fall in love with a particular thesis, whatever that is, it's going to appear true to us. And we will take that as unequivocal proof of its validity. And it's kind of true to an extent. Like, yes, there's truth in it. But what will then happen is that we will start to extrapolate that into things that we don't really know. We will actually start superimposing it on the world. So we will then start to see the world in terms of it, thus reifying it and thus getting into this kind of spiral of convincing ourselves that this thing is the truth. It doesn't matter what it is. It can be anything, any idea, any model. If you go around learning Jungian psychology, you're going to start seeing the world in terms of Jungian psychology. If you go around studying Christianity, you're going to start seeing the world in terms of Christianity. And none of it is absolutely wrong. None of it is absolutely true. And in my opinion, if we want to talk about levels of development, I think the most useful systems in this day and age are the ones that acknowledge this very fact about the nature of mind. This is the lineman. This is the point that the mind needs to cross at this point in time. It's to understand the nature of the mind itself in generating its own experience. This is not new philosophy, but it's new to the materialist culture. And that's not hard to get your head around. This is just how things have had to be to an extent. I mean, there's been plenty of shocking tragedies and evil atrocities committed every day, right? But, you know, not least in the 20th century. There's some pretty marked ones there, which we won't go into. I don't want to sit here and say that it couldn't have gone another way. Clearly, this was the action of free will of human beings. This was also the dark side of materialism. That's what made the First World War and the Second World War so deadly, is that they were mechanized wars. It's one reason. But at least the world has had to be working on some things that it really needed. It's going to need all of those lessons going forward around modeling the world, about how to use light and electricity and electromagnetism to produce certain results. These things are all completely necessary for development of our own individuality. Like, we need this base to an extent for deeper and deeper self-knowledge, because it's one thing to develop self-knowledge as, you know, a hunter-gatherer, but it's not complete self-knowledge, and neither is our self-knowledge now, and neither will it be for as long as we exist in our current form. It needs to keep going through these dialectical moments. And so there's truth in models, but there's also great illusion in such models as well. And there is no linear evolution according to Jung, or at least there's no model that can map it out. So to understand that what you're really doing is you're coming back to yourself again and again. You're circumambulating the self. And this is why we tend to encounter the same kinds of patterns again and again, because they're revealing to us deeper aspects of our own mind that are playing out in the world. Jung has a famous quote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. It's a similar kind of idea, that these patterns eventually show us what's going on inside our own mind. It doesn't deny the existence of the external world, certainly, and neither does it deny
the influence of the external world on what we experience. However, it does teach us something about the self, which is ultimately what this whole process is leading back to. So there's a great relief in letting go of models, because ultimately your mind is what there is in terms of your experience. So that's the thing you want to be working on and getting to know here. But this idea of circumambulation, I think, is quite relevant to the shadow map model, which we're now going to bring up on the screen. So just look at the right side of the screen for a second. There's a going out and a coming back here. There's a departure from the shore of the self, goes out to develop something, to maximize something, to become something. And then it comes back to assimilate what it's learned, and also to encounter its opposite and sublate those and come together in the self. So there's this cyclical process where we're kind of orbiting the self. And each time, in principle, we're encountering more of the self and coming back, encountering more of the self and coming back. So it's not a one-time process. This is happening at every scale, every day, at every level. But there's also a longer-term process that's happening over the macro arc of our lives. This is why we talk about shadow work. Because on one level, the shadow is just the opposite, right? It's the opposite of what we're conscious of. It's the thing we had to repress in order for that conscious position to become realized. On a more general level, the shadow is just that. It's the opposite. But the shadow, as it's talked about in psychology, is really that phenomena occurring as it pertains to our personalities and the macro arc of our lives. So this is why we have a midlife phase. This is why Jung considered the midlife phase to be like this third birth, this rebirth period. This is why so much changes at midlife. We're going to talk about that in a future episode, about how our whole psychic operating system sort of gets completely rewired. We start understanding our experience in a fundamentally different way. Because until that point, it might just be mostly this, like mostly the conscious movement. Like the whole idea is just to go out and make something happen. The interesting feature of our society right now is that, like, the idea is just to impose oneself on the world and just make something happen no matter what. And of course, we're all about making things happen. That's totally fine and totally great. But where that falls down is where it denies the existence of a whole. And that's why we have a very, like, despite being a product of nature, in nature, we have these very angular, like supposedly efficient, brittle structures. We're sort of expressing inexorably our own minds. Like this is us trying to establish these boxes around everything, like trying to capture everything. It cannot be done. It doesn't exist in its essence. And so there's nothing wrong with the movement. It's just the denial of wholeness that's the problem. And so that's why at midlife, there's this need to come back. There's this call back to wholeness, which must come sooner or later. Whether an individual actually hears it and acts on it and responds to it positively, or just doubles down on their thesis, is another question. But it's a natural movement of mind that must occur. And so not only in that, there's also this fact that when we take any action in the world, we create unforeseen consequences, like we create a negation. So let's stick with this example of doubling down on production in the world. So like we have a very materialist culture, not just philosophically in the early 21st century, but just in terms of like consumerism and our behavior. We consume and produce a lot of externalities. So there's a lot of consequences that come from that. But when you're pursuing an idea at any cost, you don't see that at first. This is what we all do, right? It's no different from eating a piece of chocolate cake and pushing out of your mind that there might be other consequences to that. If you do it knowing full well those consequences, then that's like a more integrated behavior. If you're aware of those consequences, as a result, you choose not to do it, or you sometimes choose to do it and you sometimes choose not to do it, you're finding a moderation there. This is integration, right? This is reconciling both sides of the dialectic. But what happens though, inevitably, is that that first movement is just very obsessed with that image of that thing, whatever that is. So it has to go out. This is that first movement out to the power position. And that creates internally generated contradictions, because the idea that we can make ourselves and our state of mind or our quality of lives better and better and better and better ad infinitum just through doubling down on a single metric, whatever that might be, whether that might be GDP, gross domestic product, the size of the economy, whether that might be our business's revenue, whether that might be the number of followers we have on Instagram or the number of subscribers we have on YouTube. None of those things are the point. They are at best mere metrics of growth. They're not the thing in itself. So in isolating that and measuring and managing that, it necessarily leaves something out. And this is the great irony, because the very thing we want to achieve is the very thing that we end up betraying in that process by insisting on it being that way. Being attached to that very outcome or that very image actually eventually betrays the very thing itself that we ostensibly are pursuing. So, Hegel was the man for this. He talked about this at length. He talks about alienation of an idea. He used a German word, Verstellung, which means like falsity or to conceal or to deceive through images. This is the reason why we have good quality art and bad quality art. It's not merely a matter of opinion. It's a matter of honesty and technical ability. But if art is just caricatural and merely doubles down on particulars, it doesn't touch you in the same way. It becomes cheesy, it becomes vacuous. Whereas go and see a great Da Vinci painting in the National Gallery in London and you just can't help but be moved by it. So, for those of you that are watching on video, I've shared an image here of a kind of mandala island. So this is a symbol that I find quite useful for understanding this idea of circumambulation. So it's like the self is like an island, and you can think of that as like a mandala, beautiful desert, tropical island, the kind of place you'd like to spend the rest of your life, perhaps, unless you were born there. And if you've ever been to a tropical desert island and met the people that live there, often the first thing they want to do is get away and go to the nearest larger landmass to experience the world, right? You might think it's wonderful staying on a desert island, but pretty soon the mind wants to venture out. It's a natural urge. This is the need to know oneself, right? So that's what we do. The ship sets sail. It leaves the shore. It goes out. It explores. The water here represents the unconscious mind. It's still part of the self, but it's not part of the epicenter of the self, and it's not part of the conscious self. So we go out on our own steam. We go out into the great unknown. We encounter things along the way. We encounter challenge. We encounter knowledge. We encounter negation. We experience the results of our own choices. We experience our own determinate negation. So this is the outward movement. And at some point we have to come back as well. And at that point, we might return with treasures. We might share those on the island. We might build things. We might establish a life there. The island is getting more and more equipped. It's maybe getting bigger. It's more bountiful, and it's becoming more self-sustainable. So I often think about this image as a metaphor for the self-development. And that's exactly what's going on in the shadow map. It's the same model. It's the same process. So you can see in this map how I've brought together a number of ideas and images, and they all relate to each other. But there's also some further details to share about this process of circumambulation. And that is that as we move out and we fall in love with an idea, we develop a persona. This is one way we navigate the tumultuous waters of the unknown, right? The unknown reactions of other people, the unknown feelings of our own mind, the unknown of not getting that job or that date, that boyfriend, girlfriend. So we develop this persona, and that's not completely untrue. It's a kind of slither of truth, but certainly not the whole truth. What happens though is we tend to double down on that. So we insist on that image, that notion. It's what we know, it's what we use, it's what served us in the past. But over time, it must necessarily become outmoded. So what happens is it produces results, both positive and negative. And over time, there's diminishing returns. Not only do the positive results seem to fall away, but the negative results of the persona seem to exaggerate and amplify. And this is not only the shortfalls of the persona itself, like the way we show up being whatever it is, very spiritual or very kind, no longer actually serves its own very stated purpose. Like, acting spiritual is arguably the least spiritual thing you can do, and yet you see it everywhere. Acting kind is arguably the least kind thing you can really do. So the persona produces all kinds of results. And then what happens is that sooner or later, those results, we're going to have to deal with them. We're going to have to assimilate them. We're going to have to confront them. But if we don't, if we refuse to, this is the root of all challenge. If we don't confront those results, what's going to happen is it's going to force a change. The need to remain consistent with the self and spirit itself is going to force upon us a physical, most likely, change. You see this on an individual scale. You see this on an organizational scale. Organizations that cannot adapt to changing market conditions. And you completely see this on a societal scale. You saw this in the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns and the home working. If nothing else, COVID showed us all, showed the entire world that actually not only was it possible to work from home, not only was it more efficient to work from home in terms of finances, but it was actually quite a productive way to work, and that most people really enjoyed doing it. So all of a sudden, like, everyone's like, oh, wow, we can actually do this. Well, there were people doing it much earlier than that. And if most organizations had been paying attention, they would have learned that 10, 15 years ago. I mean, in 2011 and 12, I was talking about, in the job I had at the time, the benefits of home working, and occasionally working from home myself as well. In 2015, I went completely self-employed, and a year and a half before that, I was already home-based anyway. So I've long known the benefits of home working, but not every organization, especially those that weren't inherently involved in, communications or technology, the idea of home working was just apparently a non-starter. Just, you can see how the desire for control, because they had their own conscious thesis, had their own need for power, right? Their own unconscious urge for power. But the idea of letting that go was just untenable. So it took the results of this circumambulation, this re-encountering the truth of what they ostensibly set out to do, whatever that is. It's to establish global communications. Okay, that might be our aim. It's to establish a health service for the United Kingdom. It's to publish books. Whatever that thing is, that might be the point of the exercise, or at least a best attempt to capture it in words. But when the actual actions of the organization no longer map to that stated aim, it's no longer doing what it purports to do. And so its own internal negation must force a change. And during the pandemic, that was a societal change that happened more or less all around the world, the home working aspect, and certainly in the West. So these organizations simply couldn't continue the way that they were. My business suffered quite severely, brick and mortar businesses, especially small businesses. But the point was that something had to come along to burst that bubble. So we can talk about the physical causes and what gave rise to it all, and we can talk about the way it was managed, and that's all good and well. But you can see how that way of working was completely untenable and simply wasn't going to last. Something had to change. It's quite convenient that it did. So it's going to end by showing you, again, this circumambulation in diagram form. So for those of you listening on the podcast, again, it's pretty simple. I'm displaying here an island and a ship, and you've simply got these two forces here, this outward movement and the return movement. It's like the centrifugal and the centripetal forces. Here I've labeled them Eros and Thanatos. So this model is another way of thinking about these forces, because often we tend to think about like evil as Thanatos or love as Eros. And actually, I would dispute that somewhat, because you need Thanatos. You cannot have a self without Thanatos. You cannot have Eros without Thanatos. If Thanatos is simply the return to the self, so yes, there's a destructive element in that, but it can also be the termination of the outmoded. It can also be the destruction of authoritarian
office-based work systems, right? Who's not going to welcome that change? Maybe power-hungry executives, perhaps, but most people are going to quite welcome that change. So that's an example of how Thanatos can be not only good and serving the self, but also welcomed by the vast majority of people. And likewise, Eros, this outward movement, this splitting of the mind, of the self, into subordinate concepts and notions. Well, this too can be both useful and unhelpful. It can be just as malignant. You know, if you get really attached to the idea of self, or you insist on your thesis to the very end, it forces a kind of change. It forces a very difficult change. It all serves the self in the end. It all serves the purpose of helping us know the self and bringing us back to self, ultimately. So some other names for these might well be adaptation and transformation. That initial movement out is generally caused by the need to adapt to circumstances. If we didn't have difficult circumstances, we would never adapt. There'd be nothing to adapt to. We'd never leave the shore. We leave the shore either because it's really kind of boring on the island and we have this just inexplicable urge to move, or maybe we're forced, and maybe our parents kick us out, right, as a teenager or whatever it is. But it happens a lot earlier than that. There's this adaptation in the first 6 or 7 years of life, which is when it appears to be most rapid, which is when, you know, we are taking on board everything that our parents say and do and imply, and maybe even unconsciously want for us. And we are adapting to that. We're figuring out how it is we need to be in the world. How is it that one must be? So you can understand how to go from that to the idea that there is no one right way to be. That's quite a journey. It has to be seen over and over and over and over again in multiple facets of your life. You have to circumambulate multiple times in countless different ways in order to see the pattern of the patterns. And that is that there's a need to adapt. There's also a need to transform. And all of this implies a self, because there are no one-size-fits-all answers to anything. And using this model, we can explain exactly why that is. And using the theory behind it and the philosophies of people like Schelling and Hegel and Kant and even Jung, they all offered really valuable things that can help us think this through. So with that said, I'm going to thank you for your time and attention. Hope you found it useful, informative. Feel free to comment down below if you have any questions or thoughts on that. And by the way, I should probably mention that because I don't mention it nearly often enough, and that is that I actually have some self-study courses available. So if you'd like to learn more about shadow work, inner shadow work and outer shadow work, you can head over to my learning site, which is knowyourself.makeitconscious.com. So there's 5 courses there based on philosophy. There's an active imagination course. There's 2 shadow work courses, and there's the 7 habits of individuation course. So head over there and check it out. It's called the Know Yourself program. And again, that's at knowyourself.makeitconscious.com. So I thought I should drop that in there once in every while. So thank you for your time and attention. I will see you in the next one.